Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at 1951's Alice in Wonderland. We're going to go through it scene by scene and try to dig up the deeper psychological meaning of this magical film. I'm super excited to cover this film today because it's probably my favorite animated film of all time. I've definitely seen this film more than any other Disney film, and it's because it's so surreal and confusing. I learned a lot in making this video today, so if you learned anything today, don't forget to like and subscribe so I can keep bringing you guys these videos. And with that all out of the way, let's dive into 1951's Alice in Wonderland. So quickly, before I get into the scene-by-scene analysis, I do want to just highlight who played who in this film. I know a lot of you guys won't recognize these actors by name, but they did such an amazing job with the film that I don't want their names to be forgotten, so I'm going to highlight them really quickly here. So Alice is played by Catherine Beaumont, who I believe was 10 years old at the time of this, and this is one of the best, and I know I said this for Pinocchio as well, but that film was also amazing, but this is one of the best childhood voice acting performances I've ever heard in my life. With rewatching the film a couple times and making this video, I was just blown away at how well Catherine did at such a young age. So she plays Alice. The Mad Hatter is played by Ed Wynn. The Caterpillar is played by Richard Hayden. The Cheshire Cat is played by Sterling Holloway. The March Hare is played by Jerry Colonna. The Queen of Hearts is played by Vera Felton. You might remember her from Sleeping Beauty. Tweedle D and Tweedle Dum are played by J. Pat O'Malley, and he also plays the Walrus and the Carpenter. The White Rabbit is played by Bill Thompson, who also voices the Dodo Bird, which is quite extraordinary because when you go back and watch the film, the Dodo Bird and the White Rabbit have very different voices. So shout out to Bill Thompson. And Alice's sister, I'll also shout out, was played by Heather Angel. And there's a couple other roles, but I don't want to go over like every single role in the film. There are a lot of characters in this film, so let's just dive into the first scene. So, in our first scene, we get introduced to three of our primary characters. We get introduced to Alice, who is our protagonist. She's the persona. She's the hero, or I guess in this case, the heroine. But she's also a certain type of hero archetype. She is the innocent, or the explorer. Now, the innocent is usually one of the earlier hero archetypes. It's usually a childlike character, somebody who's innocent. And that was definitely Simba. That was definitely Pinocchio to a degree. It was also Aurora. Aurora was very innocent and sheltered in Sleeping Beauty. And in this case as well, Alice is very innocent and sheltered and needs to learn about the world. That's what a lot of these Disney films play with, is that kind of innocent archetype of the hero, and Alice is a perfect personification of that. We also get Alice's sister in this first scene, and when you take a look at her here, she looks a lot more like a mother character, and she does fulfill that archetype as well. She's the great mother, or the good mother. She's the anima, and she's also the self. I'll explain that a little bit more at the end of the film, how Alice is more the persona and her sister is more the self. In The Lion King, if you remember from that analysis video, I said, Simba's the persona and Rafiki's the self. So the self isn't, you would think that that's the hero or that's the protagonist or that's who we're following, but the self is the fully actualized individual. So that's where Alice is trying to get to. She's trying to become like her sister. Now, she's going to go through it in her own way. She's going to dive into the rabbit hole and go through the process of dealing with her unconscious and confronting it. But the sister represents the self. She's the anima and the self and the good mother. We also get the White Rabbit. So the White Rabbit is the herald or the guide. And I particularly like that type of archetype. I don't know why, but there's something magical about them because they have a godlike or like Jiminy Cricket, right? He's got that conscious-like aspect to him. Now, the rabbit doesn't really give Alice any advice in this particular film, but he's a really funny character, and he has some weird obsession with time. He says he's always late throughout the whole film, but it's not just that he's late, it's that he's, internalizing this late feeling, and it's something that we can all, I think, resonate with, right? This feeling like you're comparing yourself to others and you don't think that you've done enough for the age that you are, that kind of anxiety that lures within us. We'll see. I'll explain that more as the film goes on, but that's embedded in the White Rabbit, and I think it's very cool, his kind of obsession with time and time running away from him. So anyways, those are the three main characters that we get introduced to in this first scene. So the scene opens with Alice getting a history lesson. Now, I don't know which history book this is. I couldn't find a reference for that. Maybe you guys can figure it out and let me know in the comments, but I think she's being read an English history book by her sister here, and Alice says that she can't pay attention because the book has no pictures. Now, in the 1965 book from Lewis Carroll, which this film is based off of, she says that she can't pay attention with a book with no conversations or pictures. They took out the conversations part to make way for Alice's sister here saying, well, there's plenty of good books without pictures, so it makes that line make a little bit more sense. I'm not going to go through every single difference between the book and the film. Somebody else has already made that video, and you can go watch that if you're interested, but today I'm just going to kind of break down the psychological nature of each scene. So she says that she can't pay attention when there's no pictures, and that in her world, all of the books would be nothing but pictures. So this is kind of like this, this childlike, whimsical wish fulfillment that she wants to have just images. She wants to have just fun, right? Just that childlike playness in her life. She doesn't want to have any structure. She doesn't want to learn. She doesn't want to, do the hard work to read the words and put the pictures together in your own head, right? That's all very difficult. And children typically don't like to do that. They like to just look at pictures and have the easy entertainment come to them, right? Sometimes you have to work for your entertainment, and that's something that you learn later in life. So that's all embedded there with the whole pictures thing. So it also shows kind of her lack of responsibility and her childlike nature. She doesn't want to sit down and take her history lessons and recite them. So Alice breaks out into song, and she starts singing about the flowers and how she'll talk to them for hours, and she'll listen to a babbling brook and hear a song that she'll understand. So her imagination's just running wild here. And that land of imagination, that land of dreams, right? She's falling into a dream right now. That Wonderland, right, which we'll see in a bit here, that's the realm of the unconscious. That's the realm of the unknown or the unexplored. And that's what our hero has to go and confront. So she's starting to build that world up in her head here. And after the song, we get this cool shot, which I never realized before, but she looks at her reflection, and a reflection, I touched a little bit on this in The Lion King, but a reflection can signify, a duality of the self. It's also somewhat a portal, right? You sometimes see people go into their reflections or go through a mirror. That doesn't happen in this case, but she touches the water, and then the ripples kind of change the image on the water into a white rabbit. So now she does actually kind of go through her reflection into the unconscious and into her dream, which is quite cool. And she sees the rabbit running, and she's like, oh, it's just a rabbit with a waistcoat and a watch. Oh, wait a minute, it's a rabbit with a waistcoat and a watch. She has one of those Disney moments where they make those cheap kind of jokes. There was too many of them in Pinocchio. It's a little bit lighter-handed in this film, which is nice. But anyways, the rabbit is running late. Why is he running late? I mentioned a little bit before about that obsession with time and this anxiety that time is wasting out. It's a human universal. We all feel it. So we all feel, every single one of us, everyone watching this video, we all feel to a degree that, time's running out. And that's built in. That's supposed to be there so you get stuff done in life, right? If you just live, there's that argument, right? If you just lived forever, if you were immortal, you would get nothing done because there would be no incentive. So that feeling of, death is coming upon you, and, time's running out, and you're getting older, and you're getting weaker, physically, like, that encroaches on all of us, and we all feel an anxiety about that. And I think that that's reflected here in the rabbit. The rabbit, it's always running as an animal, right? It's always running. It's always on the go. You might think, like, why are rabbits always running? Are they late for something, right? And I think that that's why Lewis Carroll played with that idea here. But we'll see by the end of the film that rabbit, that anxiety of time running out, that's at the end too. Like, that will be at the very end of the film. It'll be at the very end of your life. You'll always feel that kind of time running out until the clock actually stops. So there's something to be said about that, something to be said about accepting that anxiety and not letting it be too overbearing on you, not letting yourself compare yourself to others too much, and not letting it, hold you down, making sure that you're still pursuing something. That's all kind of baked in here with the rabbit being late. So let's move on to the second scene. So in the second scene, Alice chases the rabbit into the rabbit hole. And the rabbit hole signifies a couple different things. Now, I will make a couple rabbit hole puns throughout this video, and I'm sorry if I do that too often. I do that all the time anyways, but it'll be particularly noticeable in this video, but there's a lot of rabbit holes that I won't be able to go down in this video because this video could be like 10 hours long if I went into every little thing, but I'm going to try to keep it under 2 hours, hopefully. So the rabbit hole, what does that represent? Well, that represents the threshold. It's the portal. It's the gateway into the unconscious, into the chaos, into the unknown, into the underworld, into Wonderland, right? They call it Wonderland because Alice's adventures in the underworld or Alice's adventures in hell wouldn't sell for kids. But don't get it wrong. Like, Alice in Wonderland is just a G-rated version of Dante's Inferno. It literally is. It doesn't go as much into like the darker natures of humanity, obviously, but it does show us a lot of the different sides of the dark aspects of life. And it's done in a way that's, you know, you're plunging down, you're going down into the depths, which is what happens in Dante's Inferno. So anyways, that's kind of what the rabbit hole represents. So she finds a light as she's falling down the rabbit hole, and she turns on the light. Now, why is the light the first thing that she finds upon her adventure? Because that's what you need. You need light to see. You need the sun to be outside in order to investigate things, in order to make your journey start. You need to be able to see. So light is the first thing. That's why it's the first thing in the Bible as well. In Genesis, you know, let there be light. In the beginning was the Word, and then let there be light. Anyways, so then her dress turns into a parachute, obviously, and she floats down. She sees all this furniture. The furniture kind of representing tradition and history, and I don't have too much to comment on that other than it's just kind of in disorder. So all of the order, all of the furniture, which represents tradition and history, is in disorder right now as she's falling into the chaos, into the unknown. And the animation and music, particularly here in the whole scene, is very dizzying and disorientating. If you go back and watch the film, pay particular attention to the music, and it is quite dizzying. And then she theorizes while she's falling that she might come out on the other side of the earth where people walk upside down. Now, obviously, they don't walk upside down. They walk upside down relative to us, but it's just a funny little childhood remark here. And then just as she's theorizing that she's going to fall out the other side of the earth, she reaches the bottom. And then from upside down, she sees the white rabbit running away, and she goes down this hallway. And the hallway is very jagged and disorientating. It's, you know, the geometry of it doesn't make any sense. It kind of looks like Dr. Caligari's Cabinet. If you guys have ever seen that film, it's a very, very old horror film from the 1920s, I believe. And that film is very, there's a lot of inspiration that came from this like Hall of Doors scene in this version of Alice in Wonderland. A lot of the inspiration came from that film. I'll try to put a couple stills up on screen right now so you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. But anyways, now we get into the third scene, which is the Hall of Doors scene. So after Alice passes through the rabbit hole, which symbolizes her dive into her own psyche, into her unconscious mind, it represents the first steps towards self-discovery and enlightenment. It's a portal that represents the passage between worlds, from the known to the unknown, from the conscious to the unconscious, from order into chaos. Once we plunge through the rabbit hole, we're at the Hall of Doors. Now, what does the Hall of Doors represent from a psychological perspective? Well, it represents a couple things. So when she's following the rabbit, she finds this one big door, and she opens it and finds a smaller door, and then she opens it and finds a smaller door, and so on and so forth until she finds a very small door which she fits through, and then gets into this larger room, which I'll get to in a second. But what do the doors represent from a psychological perspective? So obviously they're doors of opportunity, right? Opening a door is, you know, we commonly use that in our language of opening a door to a new opportunity, you know, a new job, a new landscape, a new house, a new family, whatever it may be. But life is like that. Life is like a series of doors which you have to open. Now, another way to conceptualize this is actually Schrodinger's cat. I really like Schrodinger's cat. I think it's one of the best ways to think about reality, not just on a quantum physics level. It definitely, like, it works for quantum physics, obviously. That's what it was meant to help us understand. But you can also scale Schrodinger's cat up to the macro. And you can think about it like when you open a door, you make reality into one thing or the other. Reality is kind of in a complex state, even on the macro level. And when you open up a door, when you do something, when you look at something, when you say something, when you make an action in the world, you're opening a door and you're causing the cat to be in one state or the other, if that makes any sense. So the more you open up doors, the more you structure reality, the more you bring order to the chaos that is, the entire universe. So it's interesting that you can scale that up to the macro and think about it like you're trying to open up as many Schrodinger's cat boxes as possible. And in doing that, you also have to, have some balance and balance the scales. You don't want to open too many bad doors consecutively, or else you're going to end up in a pretty bad spot. Now, I don't want to get too much into the psychology of that, because then we're going down other rabbit holes. Like I said, I'm going to make a lot of rabbit hole puns in this video, but another way to look at the doors from a psychological perspective is kind of like an onion, right? So there's the layers, right? She goes through one door and then a smaller door and then a smaller door and then a smaller door. That's much like an onion. So there's layers of an onion, just like there's layers of the self. And in order to have a full and complete and actualized life, you have to examine the self. You have to peel back the layers of the onion of your own conscious and unconscious. You have to examine yourself. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. We're seeing her taking those first steps of self-examination through opening the doors. And then, like I said, she gets into this larger room where there's one small little curtain that she sees the rabbit go through, and then through that is another door. So this is the first locked door. So in life, sometimes you have doors that you can go through that aren't locked. They don't take much effort to walk through. Other, doors in life, you need to find a key for. You need to complete some sort of task or challenge in order to actually go through that door and find that opportunity. And she comes upon the first locked door here. So I'll get into that a little bit. So Alice goes to turn the knob, and when she turns the knob, he says, "You gave me quite a turn," which is a punny little joke that I think is really cute. But anyways, Alice says that she wants to go through the door, and the knob says, "That's impassable." And she says, "Surely you mean impossible?" And he says, "No, impassable. Nothing is impossible." And I love that little exchange. It's one to remember, really, because there are obstacles in life that seem impossible, but they're not. They're just impassable at the moment. So you might have to go back to the drawing board. You might have to take some potions, which we'll see in a second here. But you might have to go and recollect, rethink, learn some new skills or acquire some new tools. And then you go back to the obstacle and then you get through it, right? You got to find the key for the door to unlock the door. Nothing is impossible in life. There's I can't remember if he was 5'3" or 5'6", but there was a really, really short basketball player who made it in the NBA. You can be super short and play in the NBA. You can be tall and be an F1 driver. You can do whatever you want. Life is full of possibilities, and just because something hasn't been done yet and there isn't a clear route to how to do it, that doesn't mean that it can't be done. You could be the first person to do it. Imagine all the people who told the Wright brothers that nobody would fly, and then sure enough they did it. And then I think the Wright brothers said shortly after their flight that nobody would be able to sail across the Atlantic, and then sure enough that happened. So it happens even with people who have achieved amazing things. They'll doubt the next generation, and goes on and on and on. So nothing is impossible in life. Truly nothing is. You can always find a way to get through that impassable locked door, as long as you have the just the commitment and the discipline, I guess. Just have the will to want to get through it, and eventually you will. So what else does the lock and door symbolize? Well, it symbolizes the potential and the possibilities that lie within the unconscious mind, awaiting discovery. The locked door represents the barriers and challenges one faces when one attempts to access deeper understanding and self-awareness. So that's all the psychological significance of that locked door and knob. So then the knob suggests that she tries the bottle on the table, which appears just as he says it. And this happens a couple times in this scene where he says, "Oh, did you leave the key up there?" And then the key appears, and it's like, well, it was never up there. So there's a little bit of that trickery going on. And trickery is something that happens a lot in this film. There are a lot of trickster archetypes in this film, and this is probably the least trickster archetype. This is maybe the most straightforward character we get, apart from maybe Alice's sister. But anyways, it's funny that he tells her, well, try the bottle on the table, and then the bottle on the table just appears. And this is one of many subtle little math problems that Lewis inserted in his book, and we'll see it throughout the film. There's a bunch of different little Easter eggs for math whizzes out there, and Lewis Carroll was a mathematician, so he does put a lot of that into this book, or into this film in this case. So let's move on to the fourth scene. Fourth scene, they're all kind of blending together here at the beginning, but we get the eat me, drink me scene. Now, this is something that I didn't understand for a long time, and even in the past 5 years, kind of looking back on this film, I couldn't understand what it meant for Alice to grow and shrink, because she does it a lot throughout the film, and while it is a little bit of a math problem, which we'll get to in the caterpillar scene, there's something more behind it, and I think I have it now. So she drinks the vial that's on the counter, and she shrinks down to the perfect size. Now, I think her shrinking is the shrinking and growing of her ego. I think that that's right, because not only does her emotions fluctuate quite a bit throughout the film, but she needs to shrink her ego down, which we all have to do in order to, fit through some obstacles in our life. The shrinking of the ego you can also think about as the willingness to be the fool. So if you're going to start a new task, you're going to be a fool at it, no matter what it is, right? If I were to start ballet tomorrow, I'd be horrible at it, right? But if I practiced and I did it, very hard for a couple years, I could probably get pretty good at it. Now, ballet is not something that I'm super interested in. I'm interested as like a fan, but not something that I see myself doing. But that's just one example of, something that I haven't conquered, that if I were to do it, I would be an absolute fool. Now, I have to be willing to be a fool in order to learn anything, and that's something that I pride myself on a little bit, because I do have a decent capability of just going into things and accepting that I'm going to suck at it. Some people don't have that ability, and that's something that they have to work on for themselves. And it's something that's so important, because if you want to get far in life, if you want to learn a lot of things, if you want to grow as a person, you have to be willing to be the fool. You have to be willing to just get made fun of a little bit, take your licks. People are going to make fun of you when you first start doing anything, but if you can just let that roll off your back and get through the first couple weeks or the first couple months, you'll get to a spot where you feel, better than the new people who are joining in front of you, and then, things start to look good, and then, you learn something new, which is what we all should be striving to do. So I think that that's what's happening here. It's Alice kind of shrinking down her ego in order to be the fool, but she shrinks down to the perfect size, and then the knob tells her that she left the key on the table. He says that she left it there. The key was never there. It appears right after he says it. So then she's like, oh, great. So that, I think, symbolizes just kind of the unfairness of reality sometimes. I think that that's what's being symbolized here, is sometimes reality is just really unfair to you, and you got to be like, oh, well, got to go backwards and repeat that step and get it right now. So anyways, Alice is frustrated, so the knob suggests that she tries the box, and a box appears right in front of her feet with some cookies that say, "Eat me." And Alice then grows to a giant size, right? I think this is symbolizing the growing of her ego now. She was getting a little bit cocky, and then this symbolizes her ego growing, which we'll see at the end too. I mean, it's a little bit more explicit in the Queen of Hearts court scene, but we'll get to that towards the end. And then Alice, she then begins to cry. She's so emotional in this scene. She begins to cry, and obviously because she's so big, her tears fill the room, and the poor knob is starting to drown, and he tells her to get the bottle, which is floating right by his face. So she grabs the bottle, and she shrinks down small enough to go inside the bottle. So make sure you take note of this, right? So she started at a specific height, and then she drank the bottle on the table. She shrunk down, and then she went way back up, way bigger to where she was in the beginning, and now she's coming shorter than she was originally. I hope that makes sense, but she's shorter than she was when she originally fell down the rabbit hole. That's something to keep note of, because it can be a little bit confusing, but she shrinks down small enough to fit through the keyhole. She goes through the keyhole inside the little bottle, and now she's shrunk her ego small enough to become the fool and to pass through the first obstacle, and now she's out into the unconscious, into the truly unconscious and the unknown. That's symbolized with the ocean. The ocean, the forest, there's a couple things, specifically the ocean, especially in this case, is a symbol for the unconscious or the chaos or the unknown, or just that realm, the realm that hasn't been explored yet, the dark, not always, dark as in evil, but the dark realm. And that's what she's going into now. She gets sucked into it. So, the shrinking and growing of Alice symbolizes the responsibility that comes with the choices we make and the curiosity or pursuit of knowledge. It also symbolizes the growing and shrinking of the ego and the willingness to become the fool. So, that's my psychological interpretation of her shrinking and growing. So, let's move on to the next scene. So, in the next scene, we get the pool of tears or the caucus race. It's kind of both in this scene, but Alice floats through the keyhole into the ocean, right, into the unconscious, and she sees the dodo. The dodo bird. What a strange character he is, but he's riding another bird, I think, and there's another bird propelling him, which is quite funny, and he's singing, "I'll never do anything about the weather because the weather never does a thing for me." Now, I don't know all the lyrics to the song that he's singing, but that one in particular stands out to me, and it's reflectant of his lack of responsibility. I'll never do anything about the weather because the weather never does a thing for me. That's like the most, hands in the air, I'm not going to take any responsibility kind of stance you can have, because the weather, by its nature, is chaotic. It's nature itself. It is chaos, and it's never going to make accommodations for you. We all know that. Every single human being knows that. There's days where it rains or it snows and you don't want it to, and then you got to deal with the weather. But if you prepare for it, if you do something about the weather, kind of like in Noah's Ark, right? You do something about the weather. You build an ark. You get prepared for the storm that's coming. Then you can weather it. And that's taking on responsibility. And it's a very important lesson. And I think it's really funny that the dodo bird is singing those lyrics. It's just, no responsibility. And then we'll see what happens because of that. So Alice calls out, but is ignored. And eventually she lands on this little island, this tiny little island where there's a caucus race happening, where there's all these little silly animals running in a circle, creatures or whatever. And those creatures, they kind of represent the archetypical forms of Alice's unconscious, right? They're her fractured psyche, the things that she hasn't put in place yet. That's what those creatures represent, right? She's fragmented or fractured right now. So they're running around. And the dodo tells her, she falls and she gets run over by a bunch of these creatures. And the dodo tells her that she needs to run as fast as she can to get dry, which makes no sense because the waves keep crashing in and getting them wet every 10 seconds. And then it pulls out, they run a little bit, maybe get a little bit dry, and then the waves come in again. So it's a completely nonsensical situation, and it's frivolous and insane. And it's all because the dodo bird is conducting the whole thing. The dodo bird is literally a dodo. There's a reason why they used a dodo bird. He is dumb by definition. So Alice's pool of tears symbolizes the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of shared experiences and archetypes inherited from our ancestors. That would be a definition of the archetypes. And the circle of life is also represented here too. Now, it's not quite the circle of life from The Lion King, because this is more of kind of an insane version of the circle of life, but it's the circle of individualization. It's also nonsensical in nature, and the focus of the race, them going around in circles, never getting dry, kind of just reflecting the absurdity of life. I think that's what's being shown to us here is just, you go around in circles, you pursue jobs. It's kind of all absurd. It's a weird way of looking at life. It's called absurdism. It's actually a realm of philosophy. I don't really buy into it. It's interesting, and they definitely do make some good points, but that's kind of what the dodo represents. He represents absurdism and just no meaning in life and no responsibility. So what happens when you don't have any responsibility in life, when you don't take things on for yourself, when you just throw your hands up and run into caucus races? Well, you get led by dodos. Dodos are in charge of you. You get manipulated and controlled by idiots, by complete idiots. And we saw this in Pinocchio, right? Pinocchio at the beginning of the story is innocent and doesn't have any responsibility, and he decides, I'm going to go off and be an actor. And then he gets manipulated by really dumb people like the fox or Stromboli. I don't think Stromboli is a very bright character, and he kind of just pulls the strings of Pinocchio, and that's kind of what's happening here. The dodo is controlling everybody in the caucus race, and he's a dodo, right? So that's all really cool. That's something that I didn't understand before until making the video, but it's very cool. So let's move on to the sixth scene. So in the sixth scene, Alice finally gets out of the caucus race. She finds the white rabbit, and she chases him into a forest. Now, I don't know how we got to this hallway, down a rabbit hole, into a hallway, into an ocean, and then on an island, and then there's a forest. None of it makes sense, but that's kind of the point. And then she runs into Tweedle D and Tweedle Dum. Now, Tweedle D and Tweedle Dum, they represent a couple different things. So obviously they're kind of trickster archetypes, but they also represent the duality of the psyche, right? So chaos, order, good and evil, day and night, which we'll see explicitly in a second here, conscious and unconscious, anima and animus. There's a lot of different ways you could think about it. So Alice, after she follows this white rabbit and runs into Tweedle D and Tweedle Dum, they try to teach Alice about logic and manners, kind of briefly, and then they block her path. They're not letting her go. They offer to play hide and seek with her. They say if she sticks around long enough, they might even fight each other. So they're willing to do anything to keep her entertained. They want to keep her around for a little bit. And Alice says that she's following a white rabbit. And they ask why. Why are you following the white rabbit? Which is a question that we haven't really asked. Neither has Alice asked since the beginning of the film, is why are you even following the white rabbit? And she says because she's curious. So then Tweedle D and Tweedle Dum take this opportunity to tell her that the oysters were also curious. And then, of course, Alice is now curious about the story about the oysters being curious. So now she sits down to listen about the story of the oysters and the walrus and the carpenter, which is probably the darkest part of the entire film. This is really where we get that confrontation with malevolence, or the shadow archetype. So this story kind of starts with the walrus not wanting to work. He shows up to this beach with the carpenter, and the carpenter says, it's going to take a while to clear this beach if we don't mind all the work. And then the walrus says, oh, the time has come, my little friend, to talk of... And then he goes on and sings his song. I can't remember all the lyrics to his song, but it's also very nonsensical. So the walrus is done up with all this kind of nice clothing on, but it's all ratted and tatted, right? It's all kind of secondhand. It's almost like he found the discarded clothes of a millionaire in a dumpster and put them on himself, right? His pinkies are missing fingers, or he's not missing fingers, but you get what I mean. And it's quite funny because he's putting on this kind of fake persona of being rich and having wealth and success, but he doesn't want to do any work. So he sings his little song, and he knocks the carpenter at some point into this little crevice, and then he sees into the ocean and sees these oysters who they can take advantage of, right? These young little oysters that aren't even old enough to go out yet. The mother oyster looks at the calendar and sees that it's still March and it's not ready for the oysters to come out yet. So the walrus, he really puts on a face of evil here. If you take a look at this shot, he looks quite sinister in this shot, and he's kind of coaxing the oysters to come out of the ocean, and he obviously wants to eat them. And then it comes time for them, the carpenter basically does all the work. He builds the shack by himself. It doesn't look like it's by himself because there's 10 different carpenters in this scene, but he builds the shack by himself, so he does all the work. And the walrus is luring the oysters up the beach, and he gets them into the shack. And then he kind of tells the carpenter to go fetch some bread while he's looking at the oysters, ready to eat them all himself, right? He's greedy. He wants it all for himself. And the carpenter, of course, he's kind of a good friend. He goes and he's starting to make the bread, and he peeps his head out for a second. He says, do we want soup and vinegar too? And the walrus says, yes. So the carpenter goes back in, and he's preparing all that stuff. And we see the menu sitting on the table that says the oysters are for dinner. So he's basically telling the oysters straight up, I'm about to eat you guys. And then the carpenter comes out with the bread and all that stuff, and the oysters are gone. They've been eaten, every last one. And we see the shot of all the empty shells. And this scene's kind of sad. It's dark. You have these two malevolent characters preying on the innocent and weak and then eating them, literally devouring them, so they're dead now. Anyways, what does this story symbolize? Well, the story symbolizes the danger of curiosity, obviously, that was said at the beginning, and the malevolence and shadows that exist within the world, ready to prey on the innocent and weak and curious victims that are out there, right? So we have to be cautious of that, right? Curiosity is a great thing. It's something that I have a lot of, and I'm sure many of you do as well. If you're on YouTube and you're watching videos like this, you're probably a very curious person, but that curiosity can lead you into traps very easily. Just like that, you could fall into a trap. So you have to be very, very careful with that curiosity and where you walk into. And then after telling the story, they say that there's a good moral to it. And Alice says, yes, there is, if you're an oyster. So she doesn't really listen to the advice. And we'll see this throughout the film. And then towards the end, she'll kind of finally get it. But she doesn't really listen to the advice that's given to her throughout the film, right? She's already ignoring the lessons from her sister. And now she's ignoring Tweedle D and Tweedle Dum, who are in her own imagination, right? They're in her own dreams. Anyways. So they try to tell Alice another story. They get started on it, but Alice, it's quite funny. She just leaves. She's like, nah, I'm done with this. I heard one story. That's enough. And she just leaves, and Tweedledee, Tweedledum are just left there, like, still talking. It's quite funny, but we move on to the next scene now. So, next up we have the rabbit's house scene. And one last thing I will mention really, really quickly, because I forgot to mention it, is when the walrus is singing, he sings of cabbages and kings. And that might not seem like much on the surface, but it reflects how he does not know what he's talking about. He's kind of aiming towards success and towards riches and wealth, but he's so skewered by his malevolence that he doesn't really know what he's aiming at. So he says cabbages and kings and puts those two things together, just assuming that they both start with K or something. I'm not too sure, but it is quite interesting that he says that. And anyways, the rabbit's house scene. This scene is quite funny as well. So Alice comes upon the white rabbit's house. Initially, she doesn't know whose house it is, but then she sees the white rabbit, and he mistakes her for Marianne and tells her to go fetch his gloves. So Alice begins looking for the gloves. She can't find them, but she does find some cookies. So that's quite childlike, right? You tell your kid, hey, go get my keys or my gloves, and they go off on an adventure and don't come back, or they go and they get something that they weren't supposed to get, like maybe cookies. So anyway, she eats the Eat Me cookies instead of looking for the gloves, and of course she grows way too big, and she's basically wearing the house at this point. So this is kind of, it symbolizes a couple different things. Obviously there was the growing and shrinking of the ego that I talked about before, but in this particular instance, the fact that she's outgrowing a house, I think, kind of symbolizes her outgrowing home or her current situation. So, you know, when I was 20 years old, I kind of felt like I was outgrowing my home, so I had to leave. My mom's like, get out, go out there in the world and explore it for yourself. And I kind of felt like Alice, you know, kind of getting too big for the house. And that's cool. It's cool that that's symbolized there. So then the rabbit fetches the dodo bird. The dodo bird comes back, of course, and he says that they need a lizard with a ladder. And you hear that initially, and you're like, what is this dodo bird talking about? Like, we're trying to get this girl out of this house, and she's way too big for it. And you say we need a lizard with a ladder? Like, are you just trying to make some sort of rhyme scheme? Nope. The next second, a lizard with a ladder shows up, and sure enough, it's Bill. Good old Bill. So Bill climbs up to the chimney, and seeing Alice, who everybody's calling her a monster at this point because she's so big, seeing her, he gets scared, and then the dodo basically has to, you know, he's trying to coax him by saying like, oh, you'll be famous if you get her out, but he basically has to shove the lizard into the chimney, which is quite rude. And then because Bill gets shoved through, all the ash from the chimney causes Alice to sneeze, and then he shoots, the chimney shoots Bill way up into the air, and then the dodo bird's kind of like, oh, well, there goes Bill, and then Alice is like, oh, poor Bill. And you just kind of feel bad for this lizard because he shows up, and then not even 1 minute later, he's just like blown out in the sky and is just gone. But anyways, so the dodo then proposes that they burn down the house and they smoke the monster out. And the poor rabbit, I feel so bad for this rabbit. This is not the only scene where the rabbit gets screwed over, but he's like kind of like running around. He's like, no, not all my furniture. Oh no, we can't burn it down. No, my house. And you kind of feel bad for him because while it is, you know, kind of goofy furniture, it's all pink and stuff, and there's a lot of it. There's probably too much furniture in that house. You still feel bad for the guy because he's probably spent his whole life, you know, making sure he's not late at work to get that money to build his house, and then the dodo's just trying to burn it down. So then Alice says, you know, she uses some reasoning for once, and she says, maybe if I eat something, I'll shrink back down. So she grabs a carrot. And, of course, the rabbit doesn't want her grabbing the carrot, so he grabs onto her, and she almost eats him, trying to eat the carrot. And then she shrinks down to even smaller than she was before. So this happens again, right? It happened with the locked door scene with the knob, where she shrunk down smaller than she was initially. Now it happens again. She shrinks down even smaller. So now she's, I think they say that she's 3 inches tall now. So So the rabbit runs off. He goes to do his own thing because he's late. He's still late for his appointment. And Alice tries to chase him, but she's obviously 3 inches, so she can't keep up. And she gets into the flower scene. But just before this scene ends, we see that the dodo, even though Alice has shrunken down and is out of the house, and he even asks her for a match, he's still trying to burn the house down, which just goes to show how dumb this dodo bird is and how he's like completely useless, basically. So anyways, we get into this scene with the flowers, which is one of the trippiest scenes I've ever seen in film history. So let's get into that. So this flower scene, I love it, man. So we get introduced to the flowers, and the flowers represent a couple different things. So they are the mother. Initially, they seem like the good mother. They seem like the nurturing, kind mother archetype, but they eventually switch to the opposite of that, and it's really cool how it happens. But they also represent societal norms, or society at large, right? The judgment of society upon us, and they are also somewhat of a shadow archetype, which we'll see at the very end of this scene. But the scene starts with Alice running into the flowers, and she sees butterflies, right? And I'll show the image on screen here, but they're actual butterflies. But the mother flower corrects her and says, "You mean bread and butterflies," which is funny that she's getting corrected on something that is absolutely absurd and doesn't exist. But anyways, it's cool. And then she sees a horsefly, but then she corrects herself this time, Alice, and she says, "No, it's a rocking horsefly." And yeah, just these little characters that Lewis Carroll came up with are so cool. Anyways, all the flowers start to argue over whose song they're going to sing because they want to impress this new visitor in Alice. So all the flowers start bickering. They all want to sing about themselves, which shows that they're a little bit self-centered, but it also symbolizes the competition that just exists within society as well. But then the mother, eventually, she kind of gets them all together. She says, "We're going to sing Golden Afternoon because it's about all of us," which is fair. So they break out into song, and it's very beautiful. It's very pretty. Like I said, this is one of the trippiest scenes I've ever seen in film. It's also one of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen in film. All the flowers, the sound is amazing. If you go back and watch this scene in particular, the sound is just the music. There's so many different levels and so many different instruments that come through. It's really beautiful. It's a very, very beautiful scene. And then Alice gets brought into the song at the very, very end, but she messes up one of her notes. And some of the flowers are judging her a bit, and some of the other flowers are kind of like laughing and snickering. And that's kind of how society works. Some people judge you, some people don't, but eventually in this scene, everybody's going to turn on her, and we're getting right to that. So they ask, "What kind of garden do you come from?" And garden is kind of a placeholder for society. So like, what kind of society do you come from? Where are you from? Are you, English, Spanish? It could be a bunch of different things that you can have a placeholder here. But they ask her, "What garden are you from? Where are you from?" And she says she didn't come from a garden. So she's basically saying that she didn't come from a society, that she didn't come from a community. So she's a complete outsider. And then we see the shadows, right? I told you guys in Pinocchio, look out for shadows when you watch films, especially these Disney films, because they're so smart and every single scene is planned out so meticulously. They don't put anything in here by accident. So you have to watch out for the shadows. And here we see the shadows of these flowers kind of looking over her and judging her. And then the next second, all the flowers turn on her and they start to judge her. Because she's different. So they ask her, well, first they start judging all of her petals and stems, right? They start judging her beauty or judging her physical appearance, which happens in society, especially to women, right? They get their appearance judged all the time. I have no idea what that feels like because I'm a man, but that must be, pretty tough to deal with. So they assume that she's a weed. They kind of whisper to each other and they're like, "She's a weed." And they oust her from the garden, from society. They kick her out. And that's so cool because Alice, she kind of stands up for herself a little bit. She admits that she's not from a garden and that she's not a flower. So she stamps her individualization there. She says, "I'm an individual. I'm different." And society judges her for that, and they kick her out. Now, that's not always going to happen to people, and sometimes it will. Sometimes society will just kick you out completely. But society will judge you for being different, no matter in which way you're different. You can be different in a infinite amount of different ways, and society is going to judge you every single time because you're breaking away from the norm, right? You're going out from the contrived order, the order that we have, the history and tradition. You're breaking away from that, and you're going out into the chaos, into the unknown. And you might bring something back that the people don't like. You might bring something back that the people need too. So that's important. It's important to be an individual, right? So that's all showcased here in the flowers. And of course, they're flowers, right? The flowers kind of symbolizing the feminine. So all the flowers in this, pretty much all the flowers in this scene are female. There's a couple, I think, that are male because they have the male voices. But anyways, we move on to the scene with the caterpillar, which is one of my favorite scenes. So as Alice leaves the flower garden, well, doesn't leave it, she gets kicked out. She actually gets water splashed on her, and she kind of floats away in a leaf. She then sees all these... This is such a trippy shot, but she sees all these glowing smoke letters that are different colors in the sky, and she starts to follow them. And this caterpillar scene, this might be the deepest scene of the film. I say that, but then it also might be the most shallow, but we'll get to that in a second. But the caterpillar is interesting. So he's our first kind of male archetype here, or at least the first like strong male archetype, or the good male archetype. So he's the wise old man. That's what the caterpillar represents. He's also the sage. So he's the keeper of spiritual wisdom. And he's going to ask Alice a very important question, almost right at the beginning here. So she comes up upon him smoking his hookah pipe, and he asks her, "Who are you?" Now this is what I mean by this could be the most shallow scene or the deepest scene, depending on how you view it. It's a very basic question on the surface, but a question that you can ask yourself your entire life on many, many different levels and never fully understand the answer or never fully come to a conclusion. It is important for us to have kind of a sense of self and identity, and to have some sort of structure in who we believe we are, and to have some like morals and values. That's all important. You don't want those things to be too in flux, or else you'll be too far in the chaos and you'll legitimately like literally go insane. So you need to have some sort of structure in your life. But that being said, you can pose this question to yourself your entire life and never really know how to answer it, right? So Alice needs to ask herself this question: who is she? Who are you? Who are you? Like, how would you define yourself? It's very important that not only she asks herself this question in this scene, but that you ask yourself that question in your own life. So Alice says that she doesn't know, as she's changed so many times from this morning. That's kind of pointing at what I just said, right? We're constantly in flux. We're constantly learning new things and growing as individuals, whether it be, in our social life or our individual life. We're in a constant state of growth, and not just on a spiritual or psychological level, but on a legitimately physical level, right? Your atoms replace themselves completely. I think it's like every 4 years you're a completely different human being. So you're constantly changing. This thing that's you, it's not something that's one thing all the time throughout time. It's something that's constantly ever evolving, right? So she says that to the caterpillar. She says, "I've changed so many times since this morning." And that's also a sign of a good day. If you can say that by the end of your day, that means that you've had a good day. That means that you've read a book, or you've worked out, or you've worked on a problem that you have, and you've grown from it, and you're a different person now at the end of the day. You should strive to be a different person at the end of every day. But like I said, you need some sort of structure, and Alice doesn't have that. So the caterpillar's confused. She says that she's not herself, but she can't put it any plainer because it's not clear to her. Right? It's not clear to me, she says. And he says, "Well, who are you?" Because you just said the word me. So what does that mean? Who are you? He's trying to get to the core of the question here. And then Alice says, "Well, shouldn't you say first?" And he asks, "Why?" Literally the letter Y. I love that he's just blowing out letters the whole time. It's so cool. Anyways, Alice says everything is confusing and she can't remember. So the caterpillar asks her to recite a poem. He says, "Recite." She says, "I can't remember," and then he goes, "Recite." So then she starts to recite the poem that she knows, and it seems to be like a completely different poem. And then he says, no, that's wrong. And then he says a different poem that's more about an alligator and more about the shadow and malevolence, which is interesting. And he gives his own kind of rendition on it. And then once he's done, she says that she's never heard that version before, and he says that he's improved it. So this is cool. The fact that he says that he's improved it, because this is what happens with the wise old sage character, is that they're not impervious, right? They're not perfect. And you'll see that in a lot of media that you watch, that Gandalf isn't perfect, Dumbledore isn't perfect, they make mistakes. Those are just two perfect examples of the wise old man or the sage. I really like those specific examples. But here he has the intellectual arrogance, or the Luciferian intellect, to say that he's improved the poem. Now, he may very well have improved the poem, but it's saying that and having pride in that, right? That the sin of pride, right? That's Luciferian intellect is the sin of pride. So that's what's creeping through here. And that's interesting, because you'll have a wise old sage in a piece of media or in a story, and they'll have a lot of answers for the character, and it'll almost seem like they have all of the answers, and you'll think to yourself, well, why doesn't the character just sit there and absorb all the information that they can and then go on the journey once they've accumulated the wisdom of the wise old sage? Because it would seem like you would want to have all of the wisdom of the wise old sage. But the thing is that the wise old sage doesn't know everything. He doesn't. Even though he's at the end of his life, he's the most knowledgeable character in the story, there's still something that he doesn't know. And that's reflected in the intellectual arrogance here, in the Luciferian intellect. So then Alice says, if you ask me, then he interrupts again. And he says, who are you? You keep saying me, but who are you? So then Alice gets fed up with all this smoke being blown into her face, and then she just leaves. Again, she just leaves the scene. And she gets quite far away, actually, if you go back and watch the film. And then the caterpillar's like waving. He's like, no, come back. I got something important to tell you. So then she comes back, and it's quite funny because he's just kind of sitting there lazily, like he didn't just call her to come back. But it does take her a little while to get back there. She says that she wants to become bigger. And the caterpillar asks, why? And she says, because she's 3 inches tall and it is dreadful. And the caterpillar gets all red in the face and he gets all angry and he's very insulted because he is precisely 3 inches tall. And he kind of bursts into flames and smoke at this moment. He gets so angry, he literally turns himself into a butterfly, which is quite funny. And then he tells Alice that one side will make you grow taller and one side will make you grow shorter. And she asks, what side of what? And then he flies back down, gets right in her face, and yells at her, of the mushroom, of course. And it's like, man, this caterpillar's mean. But he doesn't tell her which side is which. So this is where the math problem comes in, right? She has to do a little bit of math here and figure it out. So she takes the first bite, and she grows way, way too tall. She grows taller than the trees in the forest, and there's this mother bird on her head, and she thinks that she's a serpent. I don't know how she thinks that a serpent is taller than the trees, but anyways, the mother bird freaks out and Alice kind of feels bad, so she eats the other piece and then she shrinks way, way, way down, way back down to 3 inches, and she goes, well, that's not going to work. I took small bites of each. How am I going to do this? So she uses some reasoning, a little bit of math here, and she just licks the side that made her bigger, and she gets perfectly exactly to the height that she was, assumingly from the beginning of the story, which is great. We're back where we started. We're where we started, kind of. And then she decides to keep the mushrooms, which is brilliant. She's starting to learn something here. She keeps the mushrooms for later. So she's starting to put the pieces together and learn from her mistakes of the past. So then she continues to walk and she comes upon a forest. Now, like I said before, a forest, much like an ocean, is a representation of the unconscious or the chaos or the unknown. So she walks into that and she sees all these signs pointing in different directions, and it looks like complete chaos, right? It's like, where do I go? All these signs are pointing up, down, left, right. And she hears the singing of the Cheshire Cat. And this is where we get introduced to, I think a lot of people's favorite characters is the Cheshire Cat, or maybe the Mad Hatter, which a scene after this. So we get the Cheshire Cat singing, and he's weird, man. Like he's one of the weirder characters because he's a trickster. Definitely a trickster, like the most trickster character I think I've ever seen in any form of media, because he balances the line of good and evil, like, so well. I've met people who think that the Cheshire Cat is evil, and I've met people who think that the Cheshire Cat is a good character. And you guys can let me know in the comments how you guys feel about it, but he kind of balances that line where he puts Alice in jeopardy, but then he also teaches her something at the same time. So he's kind of the perfect trickster, and he plays a bit of a similar role to Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio, being kind of a conscious or godlike character. He seems to have some sort of mystical wisdom that kind of breaks reality, more so than the other characters in the film, because we see him do things in this scene particular that are completely impossible. I mean, we see him kind of disappear himself with his tail. We see him stand on his head, literally take his head off and stand on it. So he seems to have some like godlike powers, which is interesting. So she asked the Cheshire Cat, which way should she go? And the Cheshire Cat asks, which way is she trying to go? And she says she doesn't know. So the Cheshire Cat says, then go any way you want. And she starts to go a little bit on her journey, and then the Cheshire Cat, as he disappears, he kind of reappears for a second, and he says, oh, by the way, the White Rabbit went that way. And then she says, the White Rabbit? And he says, who? He says, you just said the White Rabbit went that way. He's like, what? So he's playing dumb immediately, which is, again, he's a trickster. He's trying to trick her. But then eventually he points out that the Mad Hatter is that way and the March Hare is that way, and they're both mad. And she says, well, I don't want to be associating myself with mad people. And this is where we get a lot of people's favorite line from the film. I really, really like this line. So he says, oh, you can't help that. Almost everyone here is mad. And he says, you may have noticed that I'm not all there myself. And we get this shot where he's kind of half disappearing, half not. And I love this line because it reflects reality, right? Everybody's a little bit mad. Everybody's a little bit insane. And there are people who are truly insane. And even those people kind of, their effect kind of, society kind of pulls off of that. And they become a little bit insane themselves. They have an effect on everybody else. And a way I can describe this happening in my own life is I used to work as a security guard in hospitals. So I was around at specific spots, a lot of people who were just gone, like mentally out there. And that does rub off on you a bit. You get a little bit more manic in your mannerisms and stuff. And it has a weird effect on you, spending so much time around people who are just not quite there. And it's interesting that the Cheshire Cat is the one to point that out, that like everybody's a little bit mad. Even he himself is a little bit not there. So anyways, Alice decides, okay, fine, I guess I'll go see this Mad Hatter, and the Cheshire Cat disappears. And he'll pop up towards the end of the film and do even more trickster stuff, but again, he's such an interesting character because I don't know where to place him. I don't know if he's a shadow archetype specifically, because he's definitely helping Alice too. He's a shadow and a sage at the same time, and that's what makes him the perfect trickster. Anyways, so then we get the Mad Hatter's tea party, and this is absolutely the most insane scene of the film, one of the most insane scenes ever. And it makes me laugh every time I think of the Mad Hatter, because back in preschool, I played the Mad Hatter for a play, and I'll have to try to ask my mom to find the video because it would be really funny to post on this channel, but everyone was like at this level of singing, like a pretty normal level, and then when it came time for the Very Merry on Birthday, my voice was like, I was just screaming. I wasn't even singing. I was just screaming the lines. I've been obsessed with this film my entire life. I think I asked for this film when I was like 9 or 10 years old on Blu-ray for my birthday. And that's not like that old, but my mom was like, haven't you grown out of Alice in Wonderland yet? And I was like, there's no growing out of this film. And then when I was 15 or 16, I asked for a poster of it. So I've loved this film my whole life, and it's just funny just thinking back to the Mad Hatter. I played him in a play when I was in preschool. But anyways, Alice sits down at this long table with so many empty chairs. The only two chairs that are occupied are the March Hare and the Hatter at the end of the table. And the March Hare comes down and he says it's very, what does he say? It's very rude to sit at a table uninvited. And she says, oh, I'm sorry. I really liked your singing. And they love that compliment, so they, of course, invite her for tea, and they pour her a cup of tea. Literally, they pour her a cup of tea. A whole saucer and teacup comes out of the teapot. There's a bunch of, like, weird physics being broken, especially in this scene. That's quite funny. And then they try to explain to her what an unbirthday is, and the March Hare can't do it. He has no idea how to explain what an unbirthday is, so he gives it over to the Mad Hatter, and he kind of explains that, well, 364 days out of the year is your unbirthday, which is, it's so silly because it's similar to the dodo bird, and just how absurd it is to celebrate every single day that's not your birthday. The point is to celebrate your birthday because it's a special day. It's not the 364 other days of the year, but the fact that you celebrate all those days, there's a little bit of like joyous nature to that, just celebrating every day like it's your birthday, but it's also kind of hedonistic and like irresponsible to celebrate every day like it's your birthday. If people did that in real life, they would probably get locked up in the loony bin pretty quick. So anyways, this is symbolizing the frivolous and hedonistic pleasure in meaningless pursuits. That's kind of what's being symbolized here, the unbirthday party. So they start to celebrate Alice's unbirthday party because, of course, it's her unbirthday too. What are the odds, right? So then Alice starts to recount how she arrived where she's at, and she mentions the word cat, right? She mentions her cat at the beginning. I forget the cat's name. I don't know why I forget it, but I think it's because it's the least important cat, and obviously the Cheshire Cat's more important, but somebody will let me know in the comments. She mentions her cat because that was at the beginning of the story, and then the mouse goes crazy. The little dormouse kind of pops out of the teapot, and he's running around, causing a ruckus. He can't hear the word cat, and that sets up something for later. It's foreshadowing, but they eventually chase down the little mouse, and they have to put jam on his nose. That solves the issue somehow. Putting jam on a mouse's nose calms him down. And he sings like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat. I can't remember if that's right here, if it's a little bit later, but that little dormouse is quite funny. So he kind of represents the innocent. I mean, the very innocent. He has not pursued anything. Like, he's super scared and timid. So he's kind of like what would happen if Alice didn't go on this adventure. She would be like the dormouse. She'd be like the person that never leaves their home, that never leaves the teapot, that never explores the world, right? That's what the dormouse kind of represents here. So then the Mad Hatter, or the March Hare, I forget which one, they ask her a riddle. And as soon as they ask the riddle, she repeats it to herself, obviously, because she wants to figure it out. And then as she repeats it, they get scared. They're like, what are you saying? It's so funny because they're the ones who proposed the riddle. Anyways, that's just a little tidbit. And then the White Rabbit comes in finally. And this is the other scene that's just so heartbreaking if you're a fan of the White Rabbit, because he's got this clock that is a prized possession of his. I think it was a gift or something. And the Hatter steals it from him, and he's trying to figure out what's wrong with the clock. And he says it's 2 days slow. And it's like a clock can't be 2 days slow. It only measures 24 hours. So it's absurd and silly. But he opens up the watch, and he says that the problem is that it's full of wheels, which is so funny because the wheels is what makes the clock. So he starts digging out all the wheels, and the Hatter puts butter, jam, spoons, and tea inside of this poor rabbit's watch while he's like frantically running around like, oh no, kind of like when they were burning down his house. And the Hatter says, the Hare offers mustard to the Hatter, and the Hatter says, no, not mustard. What are we, silly? And it's like, oh, that's where you draw the line? You draw the line at mustard? It's like completely arbitrary. It's really funny. So then the watch goes absolutely haywire, and it's like jumping around everywhere, and we get all these shots, these reaction shots from the characters. And then the Hare smashes it with a mallet. And I think that's something like having a little bit of that absurdity and insanity in your life, so that you're not just all order and you're not just all work, got to be on time, got to worry about the time. You know, if you're like the rabbit, you kind of need a little bit of that chaos in your life, a little bit of that shaking things up. And I think that that's represented here with the smashing of the clock. But it's sad because the poor rabbit says that it was an unbirthday present, which is so funny. Just ties the whole scene together. It's like that was an unbirthday present. So instead of celebrating the rabbit's unbirthday, the Hatter and the Hare just throw him out of the garden. And it doesn't make any sense because they just celebrated Alice's unbirthday. But the second the rabbit says that it's his unbirthday, they're like, oh, very merry unbirthday to you, and throw him out of the garden. It's so silly. I love it. This scene is absolutely insane. So then Alice leaves, declaring that she's going home now. She's done with this silliness. She's fed up, and then we move on to the next scene. But yeah, I don't have as many notes for the Mad Hatter Tea Party scene, unfortunately, but it's because it's just such a chaotic scene. It's all over the place. But anyways, let's get into the forest scene. So then Alice walks into Tulgey Wood, which is a forest which represents the unknown, the unconscious, the chaos. As she walks through this forest, though, she gets pretty sad and lonely. And she says that she wishes things would make sense again. And it's because in this forest we get kind of the film at its weirdest, or at least its most abstract. So we see all these characters. Some of them make a little bit of sense. Like we see like these glasses that are put onto Alice's face, right? Kind of reflecting the examined life, her examining her inner self and exploring. Kind of showcased here in the glasses. So she says that she wants things to make sense again because she's had her books with nothing but pictures for long enough, and things are getting a little bit too insane and weird, and she wants tradition, she wants history, she wants order back in her life. So then she sees these kind of carpenter birds, like pencil and hammer birds, and they're making a sign that says, "Don't step on the mome raths." I have no idea what that is. They show us in the next shot, and I still don't know what these little things are, but they create a little arrow that point her to a path, and a path is presented to her. So she calls for a path, and a path is presented to her, right? "Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door will open." Or "knock and the door will answer," whatever it is, right? So she gets that, but because she's still in the land of chaos, of course, a dog with a broom nose and broom tail shows up and dusts the path away from her. And she's left with this little spot that she's standing on, and it's kind of a sad image, you know? She's looking down and she's like, well, now I have no idea where to go. And she kind of begins to cry at this point. She starts to sing, and it's a very sad and somber song. She sings about how, you know, she's gotten so much good advice, but she never listens to it. And this is her kind of finally learning her lessons. She's looking back and she's going, man, I've gotten great advice from people, and I've gotten great advice from myself even, and I haven't listened to it. And I need to start listening to that advice because now I'm in complete chaos. I'm in the complete abstract. These creatures are weirder than they were before, and I don't know where I am. So she's beckoning for that order again. And the creatures gather around, and they're starting to show that they're sad, right? They start crying and stuff. And the gathering of the creatures around the protagonist, or the heroine, in this particular instance, kind of shows me that she's starting to master the unconscious. She's starting to master the inner and outer nature of her world. And that's kind of represented too in Sleeping Beauty, when she has the gift of a great voice. And she goes out into the forest and she starts singing to all the birds and animals, and they all gather around her. That's her mastery over, you know, herself and her own nature. And it's reflected here as well, which is really cool. And then all the animals start to disappear, kind of showing that integration again, right? So now she's not as fractured. These weird creatures are starting to disappear. She's brought in the lessons in, and she's made herself whole now. She's made herself one. Not completely, right? We still have another scene to go, but that's very interesting that the animals kind of come around her, or creatures, whatever you want to call them. They're kind of all over the place, and then they disappear. And then, of course, the Cheshire Cat shows up again. This isn't the last time he'll show up. We'll see him one more time, but divine intervention comes calling, right? And that's kind of what we saw in Sleeping Beauty as well. The divine intervention. She has this mastery over nature, mastery over the unconscious, mastery somewhat over the self. You know, Aurora isn't complete at that point in the film, but she has this kind of mastery. And when she puts that out in the world, when she sings, when she uses her voice, the animals bring the two of them together. They bring Prince Charming and Aurora together. Then they dance for the first time, right, in the forest. That's when they first meet each other. So there's divine intervention that comes directly after the integration of the self and the mastery over the nature, or the chaos, or the unconscious, right? That's what we see here. The Cheshire Cat is the divine intervention. It comes in at the perfect time, right on top of the tree where Alice needs to go through, and he tells Alice about the Red Queen, saying that, you know, she wants to find her own way home, but he says, oh, there's no your way home. There's only the Red Queen's way. And this is the first time Alice has heard of the Red Queen. So he kind of tells her about the Red Queen, and he says, well, you can go that way, but I like the shortcut. And he points down, and then the tree opens up, and we get this awesome shot, which I had to use for the thumbnail because I think it's one of my favorite shots from the film. And we see another portal, right? She has to go through another portal, except this time she's going into the land of order. She's going towards a castle where all these soldiers are. And even though the Queen of Hearts is a chaotic figure, we'll talk about her in a second, she is representative of order. So it's so interesting how the film mirrors itself at the beginning and the end of the film. Anyways, let's get into the Red Queen scene. So in this scene, we get introduced to quite a few different characters. We get introduced to the Queen of Hearts, which is the evil mother. She's the shadow. She's the tyrannical leader. She's also an Oedipal or consuming mother, because she pretends to be nice. She pretends to be warming and cozy, but then the next second she snaps and she says, off with their heads, right? She has no temperance at all. She says later in the scene, she says, if I lose my temper, you lose your head. And that is the mark of somebody who's too far gone down the tyrannical path, right? They're saying, if I lose my temper, which is a thing that's on me. I mean, it's more on me than anything. If I lose control over my own emotions, there's literally nobody else I can blame for that. If there's another situation that I mess up on, maybe I can blame the state or society or somebody else. But if I lose control over my emotions, that's 100% on me. So when you lose the accountability to take control of your own emotions and you say, well, if other people piss me off, it's because they're bad. Well, now you've become a tyrant. So that's where the evil queen is at. She says, if I lose my temper, you lose your head, which also is not a fair exchange at all. Anyways, we get the King of Hearts, who is the good king. He actually, he's a little bit just. He actually saves Alice a couple times by, giving a couple words of sound mind, I guess, to the queen. And he's also a subordinate to the queen. So you'll see that the queen is huge. She's actually quite fat. She's massive. And the little king is very, very tiny. And that's because he's a subordinate to the queen. He's been whipped or however you want to phrase it. But he's not his own person. He's completely just taking orders from the top, right? And then we get the playing cards. And the playing cards, they don't have too significant of an archetype, but they're the common man or the common soldier, the common person in the world, right? So Alice races towards the kingdom and she passes through a maze. Now, why does she pass through a maze? Because a maze represents when order becomes chaos. When there's too much order, it can become chaotic, right? That's kind of the yin and yang symbol, right? When something becomes too ordered, it can become chaotic. And when something becomes too chaotic, sometimes it becomes order. It does showcase how so much order can create something that's chaotic, and that's what we're seeing here with the Red Queen. She is so ordered and so about her rules and so about everybody being on time and everybody being perfect and her always winning that it's a chaotic state. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm gonna reference the Soviet Union again. This is 4 out of 4 Disney films now where I've somehow referenced the Soviet Union, but that's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. Is that there was, so much order placed on society that it became a chaotic state. Just at the bottom, there was everybody, the 99%, and it was just chaotic. Living in gulags or even living at home was quite terrible too, right? The lack of food and the mass starvation, it's chaos. And that's what happens when there's too much order. And how did the Soviet Union come about? It was order. It was pretty decent order. It wasn't too bad. The Imperial Russia. And then the revolution happened. It's complete chaos. And then we get a new kind of order, but that order isn't well structured. It's not based off of the lessons of the past. And it's this new thing, this new communist thing, this new socialism thing, right? We're going to take all of the profits and we're going to divide it evenly to the people at the bottom. That never happened. The people at the top got everything, like the Red Queen, right? The Queen of Hearts has everything. The people at the bottom have nothing. So that's exactly what we see here. The Queen of Hearts, even though this film was made in the 1950s, early 1950s, so this is before we even knew what was happening in the Soviet Union, this reflects the Soviet Union perfectly. So I can't really avoid bringing it up. It's just funny to me that 4 out of 4 Disney films now I've brought it up, tyrannical states, but it's good for understanding the lessons. So Alice comes upon these playing cards, right? They're kind of lower numbered playing cards, and they're painting the roses red. So the lower number playing cards and the numbers can be seen as putting like a lower value on the people who are below you in the system, right? The Queen of Hearts, she's at the top. She's placed herself at the pinnacle. And if you're a lower number, you're beneath me, you're below me. And she uses fear and tyranny to control her kingdom. So these painters who messed up Pretty minor mistake. They planted the wrong color of roses. So they planted white roses, and now they have to paint them red in order to appease the queen. So they're painting them red, and obviously this is done completely out of fear. So this is what happens. This is what happens when you live in a state like the Soviet Union or any tyrannical state. It could be Maoist China, it could be fascist Germany, doesn't matter. But when the state rules with fear, the subjects of the state, they don't care about their work. They don't really care about it. These painters, they're painting the roses red only because their life is on the line, right? Their heads are going to roll if they don't. They don't really care about the work at all. So they don't care about the integrity or the functionality of their projects. And they live in complete fear of the consequences of the tyrannical state. Like I said, much like the real Soviet Union, nothing gets done. No real work gets done. So that's what we're seeing here. The painters explain that the queen will kill them for planting white roses, so they paint them red. Alice joins in. She's a nice character, so she's like, I'll help out. And just then, all the cards show up. All the rest of the cards show up. We get this kind of like extravagant little sequence. I won't show all the stills from it because there's just too many, but it's a really nice sequence here. A little bit trippy, but all the hearts kind of gather around the perpetrators, I guess, and they do it in the shape of a heart. So again, that's beckoning back to what I said before, right? The queen uses her loving, motherly nature, her nurturing aspects to kind of coax you in and then surround you, and then off with your heads, right? And that's kind of showcased in the heart here. It's a heart, but that they're holding weapons to the people inside. So it's perfect symbolism. So this is when the White Rabbit shows up and he introduces everybody, almost forgets to introduce the king. The king kind of has to tug at him and be like, remember me? So this king is like completely subordinate to the queen. And the queen sees that one of the roses, just one of them, she only notices one, is not fully painted red. So she freaks out. She goes into a complete fit, like super aggro, and she asks like, who did this? And she's looking at the playing cards in front of her, who are surrounded by the heart of cards. And what do? They all rat on each other. They all say, no, it was him, it was him, it was him. None of them have integrity. None of them have, any sense of self because they live in a tyrannical state like the Soviet Union. Like in the Soviet Union, I think it was 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people were informants. So that means in your family, either your daughter, your son, your father, or your mother were probably an informant that would inform on you if you did anything. So that's exactly what happens. Everybody snitches on each other. Everybody lies about everything. They make up lies. They say that this person did something to save their skin, and it gets bad quick. And we see that reflected here with all the playing cards ratting each other out. It's perfect. So the queen yells, off with their heads, and this phrase is actually not from Lewis Carroll. It goes back quite a ways, all the way back to the French Revolution. That's what the peasants and just the people of the land would call out, off with their heads, when they were butchering a lot of the royalty. And that's what happens here. She says off with their heads, and the crowd cheers. The crowds love violence. It's crazy that for many, many years in Europe and across the world, people would go and gather around public executions and get excited about it and bring their kids to it. I just find that crazy. But anyways, so the cards are pulled away. They're assumingly going to get their heads chopped off. And the queen asks who Alice is. And immediately before Alice can even answer, she gets her to straighten up and to curtsy and to open her mouth wide and say, yes, your majesty. And she gets her to do all these things, right? All these order things. Like I was saying before, she's keeping her in line, keeping her in order, having full control over her subjects. If some of you live with a tyrannical parent, you might understand what that's like. They're ordering every little aspect of your life, and they're reigning over you with tyranny and fear, so that when you do a task, when you take the garbages out or clean the bathroom or whatever, you do it like the painters painting the roses red. You do it with like the lowest amount of effort possible, just to get by, just to not have your head roll off, and you don't really care about the work at all. So if you want to get people to cooperate, whether it's in a business or in a state or even just in a household, you need to have that, mutual respect and communication and see each other on the same level. Even though you're parent and kid, you need to see each other on the same level. You can't just use tyranny and force to rule over your kids, or else you'll get a situation like this. So the queen is asking her to curtsy and do all this stuff. And of course, it's a one-way standard. The queen doesn't need to do any of that stuff. So she's demanding things of others that she wouldn't do herself. Key bit of information there. And she asks Alice where she is going. And she says that she hopes to find her way home. And the queen freaks out again because she uses a subjective word. She says, I want to find my way home. And the queen says, there is no your way home. There's only Her Majesty's way home. And it's just like, wow, now you're controlling the language that the kid uses. Again, this happened in the Soviet Union. This happened in Maoist China. It happened in fascist Germany, where they control the speech of their subjects. And once you take away speech from people, that basically takes away everything they have. They can't think anymore. If you take away speech, you're taking away thought. I mean, if you've read 1984, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't read 1984, that's a must read. You should definitely read that book. So, in the second half of this scene, we have the queen playing croquet, or she invites Alice to a croquet game, and as they start, the queen obviously has an advantage. The game is rigged from the start. She uses the fear that she's amassed over the kingdom to keep the bird straight, the bird or club, or it's kind of both. It's funny that she's also using a bird and a hedgehog as like instruments for her playthings, right? She's kind of, there's some sort of like animal abuse happening here. She's kind of like using those that are weaker than her for her own entertainment. But anyways, there's no way that she can miss. She misses the club. She doesn't even hit the hedgehog. She actually sucks at croquet. But the hedgehog, because it's in such fear, like the bird who straightens itself out for her, it starts running through all the playing cards. And even the playing cards start moving themselves in position to make it easier for the hedgehog to get through. So everybody's in cooperation here to make sure that, things are going good for the queen. And this kind of reminds me of Russia, not in the Soviet era, but now, with like Putin. When Putin goes out and he plays like hockey games or does judo or whatever, it seems like the people around him are kind of going a little bit easy just to make sure that, Putin scores his 7 or 8 goals so that nobody gets their heads chopped off or poisoned. That seems to be Putin's favorite method. But anyways, I think that that's very funny that kind of reflects, certainly Putin's not the only leader that's done that. There's plenty of Roman emperors that you can read about who would, set up Colosseum games so that they would win and that they would look good. Some of you might remember Gladiator. And so she has complete fear and control over her kingdom. So the games are rigged from the start. And that's exactly how it was in the Soviet Union and in tyrannical states. The jobs are rigged against you. There's no winning. Which that's what sucks, about like a communist state where everything gets redistributed amongst everybody equally. They never get anything. You can work as hard as you want. You can work in the gulag for 20 years and see nothing from it. And even the state won't benefit. The state won't have better buildings when you get out or better cars. It'll actually be worse because they're using that kind of enforced labor. Anyways, it's all just perfectly symbolized here with the Queen of Hearts. It's really outstanding that this film came out in 1951. So one of the cards misses, and the hedgehog doesn't get through. So, of course, the queen orders that card to be executed immediately. Off with his head. And then Alice's club/bird won't even cooperate because it doesn't seem like these birds want to be playing croquet with their heads anyways. So this bird's acting all silly. It flips Alice over, kind of starts playing with Alice, which is quite funny. So when Alice finally gets this bird to cooperate, and she finally gets the hedgehog moving, she actually hits it. The queen wasn't able to do that. She actually hits the mark and hits the hedgehog forward, and it looks like a nice shot, but all the cards move out of the way so that Alice loses. They all know how this game has to go, so it's completely rigged against Alice from the get-go. Now, mind you, she doesn't have to win the game or anything, but the Cheshire Cat shows up and makes things worse for Alice. This is, again, why I don't know if the Cheshire Cat is a good character or a bad one, because in this instance, he screws Alice over pretty badly here. He plays a trick on the queen, ends up flipping her over so she's upside down, and then once she gets right way up, she immediately blames Alice because Alice was the one pointing out a cat when there was no cat there. The tricks of the Cheshire Cat. And when the queen gets up, she's just steaming, like red-faced, super mad. She's incredibly aggressive, and she says off with her head. She wants to now kill Alice. So the king steps in and suggests a trial. Again, like I said, the king, he's the voice of reason, and he kind of saves Alice here, and he's going to save her again at the very end too. But they ask for a trial, which again is perfect to the Soviet Union because this is what they would do. They would get people to go to trial and admit to crimes that they didn't do. Even though they knew they didn't do them, even though the state knew they didn't do them, everybody knows that you didn't commit the crime. You might not even have been in the same province at the same time, but they'll still pin it on you, and they need you to admit it. Because if you don't admit it, you still have individuality. You still have some self-respect, some dignity left. They don't want you to have that. So they want you to admit to something that you didn't do so they can go, gotcha. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's one of the... It's hard to say what the worst aspect of the Soviet Union is, but it's one of the more haunting aspects of it. So we get into the courthouse, and the queen says something that's just so perfect. Again, she says, the sentence comes before the verdict. Again, in a tyrannical state, that's what happens. I keep using the communist Russia because that's the one I've studied the most, but in Maoist China also, the verdict would come before, or the sentence would come before the verdict. So the verdict doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you did it or not. The evidence doesn't matter. The witness doesn't matter. The sentence is already laid out for you. As soon as you walk into the courtroom, you're going to the gulag. See ya. So that's basically what's happening here, except the king, again, like I said, comes in and he says, why don't we see some witnesses? And it's almost like he's talking to the audience here, like, can we see, like, something else before this thing wraps up? Like, let's add a little bit more spice to this court and not just, like, have her executed as soon as she walks in. So anyways, they interrogate some witnesses who are all mad. They're all absolutely insane people. You get the March Hare, the Dormouse, and the Mad Hatter. They all present absolutely bogus, nonsensical remarks which the queen pretends is important, and she gets the jury to write it all down, even though when she asks the March Hare, like, do you have any recollections of these events? And the March Hare is like, nope, none whatsoever. And the queen's like, oh, that's important. And Alice is like, isn't that unimportant? And the queen's like, no. You know, so the queen's like rewriting truth at this point. It's very Orwellian. So then it's so funny because the queen says that it's her unbirthday. So the Mad Hatter, of course, has to celebrate it, and they give her a cake, and then the cake turns into a crown somehow, and then she puts the crown on her head, and of course it's a big purple crown, so you know what's going to happen. Turns into the Cheshire Cat, and I think this is the last time he shows up, and this time he really screws Alice over. She starts pointing out the cat. As soon as she says cat, the mouse goes crazy, ruins everything. The king, in all the chaos, accidentally hits the queen on the head with a hammer, throws the hammer over. They throw the jam over, and Alice catches it, and, you know, the queen takes the sheets off of her head, and she sees that it's Alice who's holding the weapons that caused her so much pain. And she's like, off with her head. You know, I've seen enough. Let's kill Alice now. And it's just at this moment where Alice realizes that she has a couple of mushrooms in her pocket. Now, I didn't mention it before because it's too complicated to get into in this video. Again, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that goes too far, but I won't get into the psychology of mushrooms or psychedelics in general. I'll just focus on what happens in the scene here. But Alice grows to, I think they say, a mile high. She's now a mile high, and then they have this rule in the court books that if you're a mile high, you have to leave immediately because they're all scared now that she's a giant. And because Alice's ego has grown now, she has the confidence to tell the queen off, which is what she should do because the queen is a tyrant. So she starts telling the queen off, but as she's doing that, she's shrinking. And then the Cheshire Cat at the very end says, you know, you're a tyrant and you're fat or something. I don't know. He insults the queen just to add a little cherry on the top of Alice's insults. And then the queen blows up and she's like, get her now. Like, chase after her now. I've had enough. I've tried to kill her multiple times. Just get her. So all the cards chase after her, and she runs out of the kingdom. So as Alice is leaving the kingdom, this is a perfect ending. This is why this film is so trippy and why it's so perfect. We revisit everything that we did in the beginning. We see the caucus race, and this time the queen and the king and all the playing cards are in it. And we see the Mad Hatter's tea party, and we see the locked door at the very beginning, and she gets up to the locked door, and she asks to go through, but the knob says that, you know, he's locked, because in the beginning, she went through in the little vial. She didn't actually unlock the door, so it's still locked, but he tells her that she's already on the outside. And this is the bait and switch, the little twist ending. I love it. So she looks through the keyhole. She sees herself sleeping under the tree, being read to by her sister. And now she realizes that she's been asleep this whole time. So she starts yelling to herself, like, wake up, wake up, wake up. You know, everybody's still chasing her. So she's trying to tell herself to wake up. And then her voice changes into her sister's voice telling her to wake up. And then she wakes up. So that symbolizes exactly what I said at the beginning of the film, right? The persona, the hero, the protagonist, the one that we're on the journey with, Alice, needs to become the self, needs to become the fully actualized individual. And you get that through going through all the lessons and adventures and trials and tribulations of Wonderland. But at the very end, her voice changes into her sister's voice to show that she's become a fully actualized individual now. She's learned something. And when she wakes up, her sister asks her to recite the history lesson, and she starts to recite the poem that the caterpillar gave her. And her sister thinks it's all nonsense, and they walk back to their mansion, and that's kind of the end of the film. But that ending is perfect because it shows, this film really as a whole shows like how much knowledge and how much learning you can get from not just diving into the unknown and the chaos of the real world, but diving into the unknown and the unconscious of your own mind. And you can do that through self-examination, but you can also do that through dreams, which I think is why this film works so well, is because it is a dream, first of all, but it's also very symbolic of how our dreams actually play out. A lot of the absurdities that happen in Alice in Wonderland, a lot of the breakings of logic happen in our own dreams. And when we listen to the archetypes that exist within our dreams, when we try to analyze our dreams and break them down and try to find the meanings within them, we can learn a lot about ourselves. I've done 2 dream analysis videos on this channel already. I'm going to be doing another one very, very shortly. And I hope to do more for you guys because I think it's something that we need to do more just as humans. We need to start analyzing those dreams more seriously. Certainly Freud and Jung have kind of pushed that in the last 150 years, but I think more and more, especially with platforms like this, we can kind of share our dreams and analyze them together. So that's going to be one of my next videos. I'm also going to analyze Peter Pan probably next. That's probably going to be the next Disney film I do. I do have a full list of Disney films and other films that I plan to do in the future. I'm not just going to do animated Disney films. I will eventually do these kind of psychological film analysis videos for films like The Matrix or 2001: A Space Odyssey and Inception and so many other films that I want to cover and give you guys my full thoughts on. But let me know in the comments which films you want to see next for sure. So that was Alice in Wonderland. I hope you guys found this video educational or at least enjoyable or entertaining. I know I learned so much in making this video. I feel like I have a much deeper connection with the film now. So if you feel the same, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share this with your friends so I can keep making videos like this for you guys. And yeah, I had so much fun making this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.